Today we will read Chapter 2, pages 26 to 29 of the English reader Little Lord Fauntleroy. But before we begin, I would like to give you a recap of the previous lesson. In the previous lesson we read that Cedric had a conversation with Mr. Havisham in which Mr. Havisham explained to Cedric that an earl was a very important person in England and was often of an ancient lineage. During a lengthy conversation, Cedric told Mr. Havisham how he would help his poor friends if he were rich. Let's turn to page 26. Mrs. Errol, Mr. Havisham said, the Earl wanted me to let his lordship know that the change in his life would bring him money and the pleasures children enjoy. His lordship here is Cedric. I was told to buy Cedric anything he wants and to tell him that it is from his grandfather. If it would make Lord Fauntleroy happy to help this poor woman, the Earl might be pleased. Oh, that was very kind of the Earl. Cedric will be so glad. If you will allow me, said Mr. Havisham, I will give him £5 for Bridget and her family. That's $25, exclaimed Mrs. Errol. They could buy medicine and warm clothing. It would mean so much to them. Mrs. Errol left the room to find Cedric. Mr. Havisham has some news for you, she told him. News? Cedric said. His little face looked quite anxious. He was sorry for Bridget. Mrs. Errol brought Cedric back to the parlour. Ceddie, she said, your grandpapa, the Earl, is very, very kind. He wishes you to be happy and to make other people happy. He gave Mr. Havisham a great deal of money for you. You can give some to Bridget now, enough to pay her rent and buy Michael everything he needs. Isn't that fine, Ceddie? Isn't your grandfather good? She kissed his cheek. Cedric looked up in amazement. Can I have it now? He cried. She's just leaving. Mr. Havisham gave him the money and Cedric flew out of the room. Bridget, they heard him shout. Bridget, don't go. I have some money for you and Michael. My grandpapa gave it to me. Master Ceddie, cried Bridget. This is so much money. Where is your mother? I must go and explain it to her, Mrs. Errol said. So she too left the room and Mr. Havisham was alone for a while. He thought about the old Earl of Dorincourt sitting in his giant, gloomy library at the castle. He was always ill with the gout, a disease that made his feet swell up. And he was always grumpy. There was never a more unpopular old nobleman than the Earl of Dorincourt, or a more selfish one. So Mr. Havisham here was thinking about the Earl and how bad-tempered and grumpy the Earl was and how unpopular he was. Unpopular meaning he was not liked by most people. And he was also very, very selfish. A selfish person is a person who only concerns himself with his own personal profit and pleasure and has no consideration for others. So the Earl was not a very pleasant person. He had quite a lot of money and he didn't like to share it. Cedric was a cheery, handsome little boy who cared about all his many friends. He was so very generous. Mr. Havisham thought of how rich Cedric would be one day. It will make a great difference, he said to himself. So Mr. Havisham, in his mind and in his thoughts, was comparing the Earl and Cedric. The Earl was a grumpy, unpopular, and selfish nobleman, while Cedric was just the opposite. Cedric was cheery and helpful and generous. And Mr. Havisham was thinking and hoping that it will make a great difference when it is time for Cedric to become an Earl, because he would be a good and kind Earl and not like his unpopular grandfather. So here we've come to the end of chapter 2. But before I end the lesson, I would like you to answer a question for me. You can send the answer to this question by making a video or an audio and then sending it to me. The question is, who is Bridget and what things could she buy with the money Cedric gave her?